Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am so happy that you're able to join us for our webinar this evening, either live or via recording if you're watching this at a later time. The topic for today's webinar is Bullying Prevention Month is every month. And my name is Karen Poplawski. I am the Responsive Classroom Program Director, and I have the honor and privilege to be in this webinar with our panelist, Caltha Crowe, who is an award-winning author and the author of How to Bullyproof Your Classroom. So she's taking some time with us since we know October's Bully Prevention Month, and even though we're winding down October, as the title says, Bully Prevention Month is every month. So we're just going to dive right in and start our conversation with Caltha. Do you know that in our question and answer section on your Zoom, you have a place to be posing some questions. So I'm going to kick us off with some questions, and then you can jot your questions in there, and we will respond to as many as we can in the hour time we have together today. So welcome, Caltha.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. So as I mentioned, it's Bully Prevention Month. And what a better time to be talking about this important topic. And one of the things I thought was so powerful in your book when it came out, which was such a great resource for me as a practitioner, was having a definition for what bullying is. Because as we know, sometimes it just gets used in many different ways. So having a definition to really just discern that was really helpful. So can you talk with us a little bit about what the definition of bullying is and just how we define bullying?
Sure, I'd love to. I mean, I agree with you, Karen, that it's so important to have a definition, especially when parents and educators interact about whether or not something that's happening in the classroom is bullying. It's just so helpful to be able to say, this is what bullying is the behavior that. And for many years, individual states had definitions of bullying, but there was no national definition. And during the Obama administration, the president and the first lady held a series of conferences on bullying and bullying prevention at the White House. I just saw it. Can everyone hear?
Yeah, that's what I'm double checking to make sure.
Okay. You know, it's popping up on my screen.
Yes.
So the president and the first lady held a series of conferences on bullying, one each year during the Obama administration. And one of the outcomes of those conferences was there was a strong consensus that all educators wanted a national definition of bullying. And so now we have one as a result of those conferences. It's actually on stopbullying.gov, which is one of my favorite bullying prevention sites. And here's what it is. Bullying is unwanted aggressive behavior between school-aged children. It's also a way that children with physical or social power can abuse a less powerful child. So that child who's, marginal socially and suddenly is getting picked on by a child who is, has a lot of power in the classroom. That's bullying. Also, bullying may be repeated, or it may have the potential to be repeated. And that meant a lot to me as an educator when they added that third bullet, because it's often easy for us to decide whether or not something's bullying by whether or not it's repeated, because that's so concrete. But often a child is subject to abuse because other children who have more power than they are abusing them. And we don't act on it because we haven't seen it repeated times. May have happened repeated times, but we haven't seen it repeated times. So I think that's a really helpful piece of the definition of bullying. And also, It can be direct. The children go out for a recess, and many children say to a new child, "We won't play with you. You're not part of our class. You're new." That's
Mm,
direct bullying. Or
mhm,
it could be indirect. The new child comes over to the group and starts to join in a game, and they just drift
mm,
away. And suddenly the new child is alone and doesn't really know why. And then the other piece of bullying that I wanted to mention that's so common now is cyberbullying, because it's very easy. Children in classrooms today are using computers so much, and so much of their education right now is virtual. And it's so frequent for children to refuse to play a virtual game with others, or for children to type mean comments in the chat box. Those little microaggressions that happen in the cyber world um, can be really dangerous. So I think those are the key pieces of the definition of bullying. Was there another part to your
yeah.
question, Karen? Or?
And why is it important that why is it important to have a definition? How does it help us as educators when there is a definition of bullying?
Well, there are a couple things I'd like to say about that. One is that often we educators get into a situation where we have a difference of opinion with a parent
Mhm,
about whether or not something is bullying.
mhm,
There's an example that I use in the first edition of How to Bullyproof Your
mhm,
Classroom,
mhm,
where uh, two children have been best friends for their entire lives because their families are friends. I mean, we've
mhm.
all been in that situation. And and one decides that he's really interested in playing softball when he starts first grade, and the other one would really rather play chase. And
Mhm,
so the chase mother is really upset because she feels like her best friend's child is bullying her child in school.
mhm,
And to be able to say, all right, is this unwanted aggressive behavior? Does the child who likes to play softball have social or physical power over the child? Or is it just that they are developing different interests? So, for that reason, the definition is incredibly important. It's also
mhm,
important because there really are different strategies for responding to bullying than there are for responding to the normal social differences between children. So,
yeah,
for example, if children are having a disagreement about whether or not to play together today,
mhm,
a social conference where they talk about, why each wants to play with whom is a great strategy.
mhm,
But if it's really bullying, it's better if the teacher handles it, if the adults handle it, because children who are chronically bullied usually apologize to the child who's been bullying them
mhm.
because they feel they are socially weaker and they feel socially weaker, and it not only doesn't solve the problem, but it makes the problem worse.
Uh, That's so. Thank you so much for one, not only helping us understand how the definition can be helpful as educators, but giving a couple concrete examples on how the way we step in, the way
Mm,
we interact will change. So we are still doing something. We're still always
mhm,
going to be there for the students, but how we approach that changes based upon kind of what we face. And so educators right now are in a very unique situation.
mhm.
Some are teaching hybrid where they have some students at home, some students in their classroom, some are all virtual, some are in class socially distanced. And so as we think about this, the issue of bullying, why is it in what we face, not only with COVID and the unique learning circumstances we now have students in and not as connected, but also in thinking about what we as a nation have really come together to really think about issues of social justice and how
Mm.
important social justice is. So we've got this very unique time in
Mhm.
going on in 2020, as I think
Mhm.
everyone will agree. So why is bully prevention important now more than ever?
Oh,
How
there's
can
so many things I could say about that. Um,
well, great, Caltha, because we have an hour, so we can unpack this whole
right.
wonderful conversation.
Well, one of the pieces is that this is a very stressful time for children and their families. And for that matter, for we educators too. But I'll focus on children and their families. Um, Children are learning, many children are learning virtually from home. Some of them because their parents have made that choice. They've decided that they want their child to have a virtual experience instead of going to school. Sometimes because their local school has made that choice. And often they're in a position where they are learning in several different environments in rapid succession. There are children who go to school physically, then someone in their class gets COVID.
Mm,
Then the class ends up saying goodbye, or sometimes not even saying goodbye, sometimes receiving a text or an email that school isn't going to be meeting for a few months. And so suddenly they're in a virtual setting again. So there's that churning from one setting to the next. Um, then, of course, there's the fact that virtual learning works better for some children than others.
mm,
There are all the children who really don't have a strong internet connection at home are learning on their mom's iPhone, and the mom needs it too, and siblings need it too. So some children actually have very unstable, let's say, internet connections and don't aren't getting as much out of school as somebody else in their very class who has a stronger internet connection or has a grandmother who's home helping them with their learning. I mean, there's such a range of the opportunities that children in the very same class are receiving. Um, and children who are stressed tend to fall into exhibiting microaggressions
mm,
that that I refer to as gateway behaviors.
mhm.
If children are stressed, they can easily start making mean comments to their classmates, or they can start rolling their eyes if a classmate says something. Those little behaviors that in and of themselves aren't bullying, but they can be really destructive to the group. So, um, research shows that a positive classroom community is protective against that kind of casual cruelty. And the American Psychological Association has a definition of positive classroom community that I've found really helpful. Um, Clear classroom rules that children believe in. So those rules that we create in our physical classrooms, we need to create in our virtual
Right.
classrooms too. Um, Engaging learning is another aspect that the American Psychological Association says is a key piece of positive classroom community. Keeping our lessons interesting, keeping children's activities
Mhm.
interesting. And this is challenging to do when we're doing a whole new kind of teaching for us. To
Yeah.
keep it fun and interesting and moving along, and so that children want to go to school for the learning part. Um, and then, of course, positive relationships, student to student and teacher to student, so that children want to be in school with their friends.
Mhm.
And that lack of routine and constant change can make it hard to create that positive classroom community. But of course, we know that's what responsive
Mhm.
classroom is all
Yes.
about.
Yes.
So we have all those techniques that really help to
Mhm.
create it.
And Caltha, it just highlights and also gives such powerful credence to the reason that, as educators face this, one of the main things they reached out to us for and said and
Mhm.
asked for were help. We need to keep morning meeting going. We need to keep
Yep.
responsible advisory going. Because we know that that powerful community is one of the biggest combaters, and it can combat so many bullying issues and so many things by creating that positive climate. Um, and so as we think about that, you pointed out and you talked a little bit about gateway behaviors and the importance of these
Mhm.
mean behaviors. And I find it interesting when you said that, and I think we can all relate when we're stressed, sometimes we aren't always our best selves. And
Mhm.
so with all this pressure cooker going on for the adult and students, what are some things teachers can be looking out for? What are some small acts, microaggressions? What are some ways they can stay attuned to some of those gateway behaviors?
Sure. And a lot of those gateway behaviors are things that are easy to ignore.
Mm,
So we're teaching a lesson virtually, and we divide children up into breakout rooms.
mm,
And as they go to their breakout rooms, somebody rolls his eyes. And rolling your eyes once in and of itself isn't bullying. But if we as educators aren't right there and ready to say, in our virtual classroom, we treat each other kindly,
mm.
that eye rolling can escalate to multiple eye rollings. Everyone in the class refusing to work with the child who the eyes were rolled about. Those tiny little things, or a snide comment in the chat box
Mm,
as we're teaching a virtual lesson. And it doesn't even have to say the name of the child that the snide comment is about, but just that little snide comment is a way of trying out, can I get away with this? And to firmly, calmly, kindly say, classroom rules
mm,
is all it takes to turn that little moment around
mm.
so that it doesn't begin to escalate into actual bullying.
Such quick, powerful, clear, direct language that really can, as you say, uphold that positive community, keep those rules, which are an essential part of it,
Mhm.
alive. And I think that you also talk a little bit about the power of observation and how challenging that must be right now. And
Mm.
any tips for how we can make sure we're staying attuned and checking in and kind of keeping a pulse on students so we can notice those changes and notice some of those
I
behaviors.
was actually talking to a friend about this yesterday who teaches first grade in our local school.
Hmm.
And she was saying that one of the keys for all educators in any setting is that we don't leave our students alone.
Mm.
We don't walk out of the room and
Hmm.
leave our class alone. Of course, that's what, we all
Hmm.
have done for our entire careers. And
Hmm.
virtual learning's the same.
Hmm.
If we're sending them to breakout rooms, we need to stop in at the breakout
Hmm.
rooms.
Yeah,
And I mean, it seems so obvious,
yeah.
but with teachers with so many balls in the air,
Hmm.
it's got to be really hard to do right now. And yet,
Hmm.
if we don't do it, we will, things will escalate, things will blow up. We will be working much harder than we would otherwise have
Right,
to
right.
make sure that children are being kind to each other.
And one of the things that I think was so powerful when I read your book was this notion of making sure that as we voice trust and responsive classroom, we address the deed, not the doer, and
Mm.
the importance of talking and discussing bullying behavior
Mhm.
versus someone being a bully.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about additional advice you may give, or why that's so important, and how we can be supporting, as you mentioned earlier, different points of views where someone may come in and he's a bully, she's a bully. I don't want my student with that student because they're a bully. And so others may be using
Yeah.
these labels. How do we shift that conversation, and how do we really help others, including
Mhm.
parents and other students, address the D, not the doer, so we can really heal the behaviors versus the
Oh,
emotion?
it's so important. In fact, in my when I was teaching responsive classroom this summer,
Mhm.
one of my participants brought that up
Mhm.
and said that she, one of those, I have a student who, she
Mhm.
had a student who was engaging in bullying behavior. And when she spoke to the student about it, the student said to her, but I'm not a, and she hadn't used the word bully. And the
Mhm.
student said, but I'm not a bully.
Mhm.
We're all concerned about that. So any of us can engage in a bullying behavior.
Mm.
And chances are that each of us engaged in at least one bullying behavior, even if it was with one of our siblings when we
Mhm.
were children. And it's a normal part of life to try that out. And if children try that out, it can escalate, it can get worse, it can go on for years. Um, there's another story that I told in the first edition of How to Bullyproof Your Classroom of a child who was a friend of my family's who had been really bullied the first day of kindergarten.
Mm.
And the bullying continued until he was in seventh grade,
Mm.
because no one knew about it, and it escalated and it got worse and it got worse and it got worse. But if we can focus with our students on using the language bullying behavior, if we can
Mhm.
use terms like cruel behavior or social cruelty and focus on the behavior, then
Mhm.
the child doesn't take on the identity of I am a bully. And that identity of I am a bully can easily lead into adulthood. And yet, to talk about bullying behavior and let's all work together to solve the problem of this behavior means that we're a team. We're working together to create a kind classroom and to make our classroom a place where everyone's included, everyone's treated kindly. I mean, what a difference.
Mhm. Yeah.
Because in some ways, bullying behavior that children engage in is even worse for the child who bullies, because that child who bullies is could be taking themselves down a really negative path for the rest of their lives.
Mhm.
And we need to use our responses and our language and our modeling and all of those things to show that child who's engaging in bullying behavior that they too can be a kind and cooperative person who's part of the classroom community.
So what may that look like as we're thinking about, thinking about this unique situation? I sometimes think about the students who the relationship really had to be there to help really change and invest some behaviors in the classroom. Because as you mentioned, sometimes stressors and other things, there was a hesitance to want to be involved, and there was so sometimes there was a sense of taking out some frustrations on some others that could lead into bullying behavior.
Mhm.
So thinking now, how can we support students if that student's only showing up a couple hours in a Zoom room, but we see some of these behaviors? How can we really help those students turn that around?
Oh, there is so many things, and in a lot of ways, they're the exact same strategies that we use in our responsive classrooms,
Mhm.
just in a new format.
Mhm.
I mean, the think about all the children who come to virtual school because of morning meeting, just
Yes,
the way they come to physical school because they want to
yes.
get there on time because of morning meeting. And all the strategies that we in Responsive Classroom use in our morning meetings, where children are assigned to partners that maybe aren't their best friend yet, but a way that they can get to know everyone and be treated kindly by everyone.
Mm,
And I mean, I'm thinking about some of the strategies like partnering children up and creating Venn diagrams.
mm,
What's the same about you and what's different? And each of those being so important. What's unique about me and what's the same about me and my partner? I mean, it's such a small thing, and yet it can make the classroom community feel safe and enjoyable. Um, or things like, our activity, find 5 things that you have in common. I mean, those are things that can be set up in a breakout room just the way they're set up in a classroom.
yeah. And what you say, it highlights that it does come back to that belonging and significance, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Does
Mm-hmm.
come back to that and being able to create that for students and have them feel part of that. So as we, again, for those of you joining us live here, I would invite you to chat some questions in the question and answer. We'd be happy to take some of your questions in there if you want to go ahead and post some of those in there. I have a few more offline questions that some individuals have posed that someone on my offline asked, how has bullying changed over time?
Oh, that's so interesting. Um, when I was a child, bullying was mostly physical.
Mm-hmm.
That was the most common type of bullying is, I mean, I remember some boys in my class who used to, walking home, tie kids to trees.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the way children bullied each other then.
Mm-hmm.
Now, physical bullying is not very common.
Hmm.
And it's the least common type of bullying. It still sometimes happens, but not as often. The most common type of bullying is verbal.
Mm.
And the second most common type of bullying is social, excluding someone, um, chronically excluding someone. But bullying is really less common. I mean, physical bullying. And then, of course, the other thing is cyberbullying.
Yeah.
Um, I could say a lot about that.
Mm.
Cyber children use cyber devices at incredibly young ages now.
Mhm.
2-year-olds, 3-year-olds are, busy playing games virtually, are busy, typing things into the chat room virtually, speaking and it turning into words. I mean, all of those things. And there actually are some very interesting things that people have written about teaching children about being kind in a
Mm.
cyber environment as soon as they start using a device.
Yeah.
The minute a child starts using a device, it's part of our job as adults to treat, how are we going to use our tablets to treat our brothers and sisters or cousins or whoever we're chatting with kindly?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if we think they're too young to do that, we're wrong.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Um,
And it seems, it's in the same way that we observe and watch, as we had pointed out before, we observe and watch and help look
mhm,
for those leading edge behaviors and
mhm,
turn students back to
mhm.
the rules. That holds true with devices and cyber communication as well.
Yeah. As soon as they start playing games in a cyber environment, we need to start teaching them about being inclusive. Um, right now, the most common platform for slightly older children, 9, 10 years old, is YouTube, and children are making YouTube videos. So,
Mm,
and if you go on YouTube and type in bullying, you get to see some really mean things that children have created. And to teach children, if you're going to create a YouTube video, how can you create it so you're being kind to your friends?
right. That seems so powerful and important.
And so different from the way bullying used to be.
Right. Yes. That is very interesting. And so we have someone who has a follow-up question from the who posted a question in the Q&A section. What might we do about the mindset belief of some adults that bullying behavior is part of kids being kids and that it builds character and toughens kids for a hard world? Mm.
Ouch. I'd just like to say a couple things about that. There is evidence that children who engage in bullying behavior commonly as children have higher rates of going to prison as adults.
Ah,
So, it may toughen them up, but do we really want our children to have that kind of toughening up?
yeah.
So,
Wow.
that's one thing to think about. Um, I'm just trying to think about what the other thing I wanted to say about that was. The other thing is that often there's a lot of evidence that often adults don't in don't respond to children's bullying behavior because they're not sure how to.
Mm,
And lots of times people who say it's good for children to have to deal with bullying,
yes.
it's in fact because they don't know how to respond, how to
Mhm.
stop it, what to do about it. And that is actually when people are interviewed as part of research studies, the single most common thing they say is, I'm not sure how to deal with it.
Wow. That
So
is
that's a real argument for schools and educational institutions having, prioritizing staff development for teachers and for paraprofessionals and for all educators on how to respond to bullying when you see it.
because the research vets out it doesn't end well for anyone. It doesn't turn
That's
into
right.
good long-term positive outcomes for anyone involved. And to pay
And then
attention.
you, and then you think about how important it is in today's world for adults to be able to collaborate, to be able to work cooperatively. I mean, isn't it better for adults to be able to work together than to be able to be mean to each other and be tough about it?
And so
And
as you think, yeah, I'm
go ahead.
sorry, Kathy, go ahead.
No,
As you're talking, you remind me of someone had posted a question as we think about what are students seeing and how are students emulating adults that they're seeing? Is there any research that we're seeing any more bullying behaviors because of their exposure to adult bullying behavior? Of if they see bullying from someone who's supposed to be a role model, or
mhm.
I will say it's shocked me sometimes, even in grocery lines, to see the aggressive conversation to a worker who's just trying to do what they need to do and trying to they're exerting power, they're being aggressive, and our young children and our students are seeing this and seeing this in adults. Even on TV, they may see role models, leaders,
Mhm.
people are supposed to be looking up to. Do we see that translating the way we're behaving as adults? Is that a problem? And does the research show that that's a problem and something we need to be aware of?
There's shockingly little research on adult bullying. And I'm not sure why. I mean, it's certainly also true that there are lots of anti-bullying laws, and they're all about why children shouldn't bully each other.
Mm-hmm.
There's shockingly little in the legal work about whether or not it's okay for adults to bully children.
Wow.
But we know from our experience as teachers that children model after us.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
we know that.
We know that. That we know.
Anyone who's taught for even a very short
That
amount
we
of time
know.
knows that.
That we know. That we know.
And for us to make snide comments to children normalizes it and makes it okay for children to do the same to each other.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I think that's just, I think it's kind of eye-opening just because we really are the role models, and adults in the world really are the role models. And sometimes it reminds me, sometimes we ask more students than we as adults pony up and do ourselves, you know? So
Yep.
it's an eye-opener to all of us to be cautious of that and think about how we talk to students about it, or how we, if we see it, being able to say, do you think that was a respectful interaction? Or talk to me a little bit about what you saw.
And if we're going to say that to our students, it's
Yeah,
important for us to have respectful interactions with our colleagues.
exactly. Yeah.
And if we don't, what are we going to get from our students?
Yeah.
And I think what you're raising is important, Karen, too, because right now it's not just the children who are feeling stressed.
Yes.
And for us to think about how we can manage our stress so we can be positive role models for our students is really important.
Yeah, it's very important. We have another question from one of the attendees. And so I'm going to read this question to you. As I observe many teacher social media groups and watch their own frustrations increase, it seems as if they're almost beginning to show some microaggressions themselves. Please do not misunderstand. I believe that just like children, it comes from a place of frustration and lack of feeling power. I'm wondering how we can empower educators, families, and students in their virtual world, in their opinion, knowing we are all doing the best we can.
Oh boy. Yeah. And especially because educators don't always have power about some of these huge decisions. Like, are our classrooms going to meet in person? Or are they going to meet virtually? If they're going to meet in person, are we going to have adequate social distancing, adequate masks, adequate, all the things that we need to stay safe ourselves? So there's every reason to be frustrated. And then let's put on top of that the fact that, back to the cyberbullying,
Yeah.
the fact that there's a lot of research that interaction in the cyber world can really escalate for anyone. We might be frustrated about something, so we send a text to a friend.
Yes.
The friend texts back, and we're not seeing the friend, we're not seeing the body language, we're not seeing the facial expression, and the friend texts back and escalates it a little bit more. Then we text back and escalate it yet again. And that escalating of communication in the cyber world is so common. It's a problem for our students, and it's a problem for us. And it's really important for us, and in communication with our students, to teach our students that sometimes there are things that it's just better to say in person.
Yes. Yeah.
And if we're posting on Facebook or texting our friend, that sometimes it really is better to, it sounds very old fashioned, but it really is better to pick up the phone and have a conversation than to escalate ourselves and our friends and get more and more worked up.
Yeah. It reminds me of and I hope I quote it right, of the checklist. Is it kind? Is it helpful? Is it true?
Yeah.
To be checking. And that's just one example but I think the power of us being able to relate with students and being able to model for them and being able to give them some different ways for them to think a little bit about And honor that that's natural, that it's natural that they're going to have these different engagements, and because the stressors are going to elevate it. But
Mhm.
being able to give them some key go-tos for them to reflect, for them to
Yeah.
think, for them to pause.
I'm
And for
thinking
all
about it.
of us.
I'm
Mhm.
thinking about a different friend of mine who teaches in the local public school who was very stressed about going back to school physically because her
Mhm.
husband's a little older than she is, and she was
Yeah,
worried about, could I get COVID and give it to my husband?
right.
And, as she texted back and forth with friends and got more and more worked up about it, she finally just picked up the phone and called her principal.
Yeah, yeah,
And her principal had a lot of really useful suggestions for, modifications they could make so that her setting in school would be safer for her. But it really took a
yes,
not face to face, but voice to voice communication.
yes. That connection, that power of human connection. We
Mm.
know it's one of the biggest builders of empathy, and so being able to have that. There's something about being able to see someone, hear someone's voice, and being able to communicate with people to
Mhm.
people, that it seems important to remember. And especially as we think about this issue of bullying, how it can really prevent some of those pieces. I have another great question that came through. When to involve parents?
Oh, yes. I think involving parents is really important. And
Mhm.
I think that when we involve parents, one of the things that we need to be really careful about is using the word bullying.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the word bullying is such a hot button.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very important to involve parents on both sides and
Mm-hmm.
let them know what's going on, keeping it concrete,
Mm-hmm.
matter of fact, and just even keel.
Yeah.
This is, you know, yesterday the children got off the bus and Maggie was crying. She said that another student, notice that another student,
Yeah.
because, it really, there are legal ramifications.
Sure.
It, keeping things private. She said that another student snatched her hat. And to the other parent, um, yesterday, another student reported to me that Jim snatched a child's hat. Just keeping it concrete, keeping it solutions oriented.
Mhm.
What actions can we take to make sure this doesn't happen again? And at
Yes.
the same time, not using the word bullying because that is such a hot button. No one wants to hear that their child is a bully. And
Yeah.
and to do it sooner rather than later, because we don't want parents calling us
Yes.
and saying, this is what happened. And the other piece about parents is that parents usually know more about these actions than we do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Children are very unlikely to tell their teacher about bullying, or, we can work on it, we can get them to report more, but it's not going to be their first action. Whereas children are more likely to tell their parents, or parents are more likely to see things that are going on in the neighborhood, or parents may be having similar interactions with with another parent in the neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
and children may be mirroring what's going on with their parents.
Mm-hmm.
So the more we can tell parents before they're calling us to tell us, the better.
Mm-hmm. Caltha, you bring up the point of reporting, and I know in the book and in some other pieces of literature we have, which really talks about the need at certain ages for some students to tell,
Mhm.
and that notion between tattletelling and and other regulating, and the importance of encouraging students to report, and we can discern.
Mhm.
How can we proactively set that up with our parents too, so that something doesn't fester and a student's coming home, and then you hear, and I know from personal experience, student
Mhm.
comes home, you hear a name one time, you kind of think, oh, that happened. You hear a name again, You think, oh, okay. But then by the time you're up to 3 or 4 or 5 times, you're processing, you've processed, you're at a place when you go to address it, you're in a different state than had you reported the first time.
That's
So
right.
how can we open the lines of communication? What can we be saying even, it's parent-teacher conference time now.
Mhm.
It's, we're settling in. What's a great way we can engage in this conversation so parents know we want, what are some avenues and ways we want to hear if students are having conflicts so we can support that?
I think it's so important to be direct. And at back to school night, at parent student conferences, at whatever you're doing right now, to connect with parents, to say clearly, the most important thing to me is that children in this class treat each other kindly.
Mm,
The most important thing to me is that children in this class include each other. Because
mm,
if they don't feel cared for, if they don't feel included, they will not be in a place where they are ready to learn.
yeah.
And I know that sometimes parents know things that I don't know.
Hmm.
And if you let me know when you know some of those things, I'll be able to act on it. And I won't if you don't tell me. And I know it's hard. I mean, my daughter had an incident with my grandson's school, a week ago, and she called me from the parking lot at school, and and I said, "Tell the teacher, tell the teacher." I must have said it 10 times before she finally did, and then it got resolved.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think we have to be crystal clear with parents about that, and that we care, and that we want to know, and that we can act on it if we do know.
Yeah.
We can't if we don't.
And also giving, I find one of the things that helped me as an educator is sometimes the teacher language and the sentences and the ways to present information helps to express what we really need. So it sounds like even giving some different ways of just telling. So send me a text that says this happened when.
Mhm.
Some examples of those, so that we can discern through, as you had said, what I appreciate so much is that importance of the matter of fact. Let's
Yes.
let's look at the facts versus emotions because it gets emotional. It's your
Mhm.
child, but how we
Mhm.
can help them form some language. That seems powerful. So I appreciate the direct language you use. That's a model of that
Mm.
really shows the facts and helps us sift through it all. So as we have time for a couple more questions. And at what point do, would so this is really a little bit about well, it's a little past prevention, so we can look a little bit at it. It's looking at if the behaviors are persisting.
Mhm.
Where do consequences fit in with that? Where do our need to protect the dignity of the child, but also the dignity of the group? How does it all kind of fit into this issue
Okay.
of bullying?
Um, as I said before, I think it's important to deal with a child who is bullying separately from the
Mm,
child who is being bullied.
mm,
Nothing good comes out of trying to work with them
mm,
together to resolve things. Another piece that I'd like to mention is that bullying is usually not one child. Bullying
mm,
is a social act.
mm,
A social act that is engaged in to show one's power to the group.
mm,
And often it is two, three, four children who are engaging in bullying to, and social cruelty towards one child. And another strategy that I've used that I has works pretty well is to divide up those two, three, or four
mhm,
children who are engaging in the behavior. Um,
mm,
because you're engaging in this behavior when you get together for the next week at recess, you cannot play together and you need to be either by yourselves or working with
Mhm.
other people. But, if bullying is social and if bullying, then the first step is to break up that social group that's making life miserable for someone else.
Yeah, that seems you give that example. I have to think that that's hard for educators now if they're seeing,
Well, and
we can control we can control those and break out groups and who we partner. And it's a process, but it seems, something that it would seem challenging right now. And the
yeah,
proactive
but
is so much more important. Yeah.
and yet so much of teaching right now is teaching small groups, teaching a math group,
Mhm.
teaching a reading group, and
Mhm.
there are ways to divide children up that aren't going to interfere with their learning.
Right.
I mean, you
Right.
don't want to put someone in a different reading group in a way that would
Right.
interfere with their learning,
Yeah.
but yet to divide them up so that you're learning with other people
Mhm.
and not with the people who it's working for you to bully
Mhm.
someone.
It comes back to that belonging in that community and being able
Mhm.
to, it really all comes back to ways to set students up.
And also, the other piece I think it's important to keep in mind is if you're going to separate people, if there's going to be a consequence for someone, it should be the someone who's doing the bullying.
Mm.
We oftentimes, we educators will separate out the child who is being bullied. And that's not really fair when they're not the one who's initiating the negative behavior.
So Caltha, we're kind of rounding out our time. And so I want to have a chance for you. This has been a really powerful conversation. And I think the one thing, having read your book and having engaged in many conversations with you, the one thing I always appreciate about connecting with you is I always walk away smarter. I always walk away
Thank
thinking
you, Karen.
about one thing new. And you gave us a lot to think about today. As we close up, are there any any closing pieces of advice or thoughts you'd like to give educators as they're thinking about creating these inclusive environments and keeping bullying from taking root?
I'm going to say two things. One is that it's all about teaching into kindness, teaching into inclusion,
Mm,
those two things. And
mm,
those two things being our expectations,
mm,
using those responsive classroom strategies that we
mm.
use in physical classrooms, they all work in virtual classrooms too.
Yes.
And the other thing I'd like to say is that, I am revising How to Bullyproof Your Classroom, as you know, and I'm not sure when it's going to come out, but it's going to be fairly soon. And the thing that I'm most excited about the new edition is all the research I did on cyberbullying
Mm,
and
mm,
everything I learned about cyberbullying, what it is, how it's different from other bullying, and some of the strategies for preventing cyberbullying that I learned about in doing research and included in the book. And so, I
mm.
hope people read the book because it really has some, a whole new set of thoughts and ideas around cyberbullying.
Well, thank you, Caltha. And I know we're all looking forward to that. The first edition is absolutely amazing. It just is really eye-opening in so many ways. And it really reaffirms, as you mentioned, that as you mentioned, I will say responsive classroom really is a timeless pedagogy. It
Mhm.
stands the test of time. And as educators know, those of us joining live or via recording know, it's helping us get through this too. And so
Yeah.
we're always stand ready to help. We encourage people to check out our resources on morning meetings, since that's one of the key pieces, morning meeting and advisory. We do have those examples of virtual and in-person social distancing that people can turn to and get some ideas for modifications. We also all of our one-day workshops, and we're offering them on evenings and on weekends. And we've actually made sure that we've included some real practical examples for people so they can see the connection to their virtual learning environments and their hybrid environments and all those pieces. So all those things will go a long way for us to continue this great work of bully-proofing our classroom. So we thank you for starting this charge of really turning our eye toward this important issue, and look forward to our continued work with you, Caltha.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. This was really fun.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
And
Everyone,
thank you, everyone who came to the webinar.
yes. Yeah, thank you all for joining, and have a great evening, everybody.
Okay, take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.